president of the Historical Society, but I'm also co-chair of the Medfield Historical Commission. We're appointed by the Board of Selectmen, and we have Medfield's demolition delay bylaw as a resource to help us protect our old houses from quick demolition before alternatives to demolition are considered. But nevertheless, I sometimes feel as though we're fighting a losing battle on it, and we'll see what Richard has to say about it. Before Richard starts, I've got a few announcements about upcoming events. The Peak House Pantry Sale is, as always, the Saturday before Thanksgiving. This year it's November 21st from 9 to 1. We will have baked goods, cheese, and other usual yummies. It's our biggest fundraiser of the year, and we depend on the revenues from it to help pay the bills, because we have the same electric bills that anybody else does, like utilities and we also have a white elephant table, and that is something that usually helps the bottom line a lot. This year we don't have as much as we had last year, and so I'd ask each of you to check your attic and your cellar again and see if you can find things that are too good to throw away but that you don't really need, and donate them to the pantry sale. Best thing is to drop them off on the Friday before. That's the 20th from 2 to 4 at the Peak House, so that we can put them in on the table on Saturday to raise some money. I've also been asked, the Peak House Pantry Sale needs bakers and baked goods. And Susan Levitt, who's sitting there, has asked me to say baked goods can be dropped off at the Peak House on Friday the 20th between 2 and 4, and on Saturday starting at 8 o'clock. And contact Susan if you're available to help bake the pies or contribute baked goods to the sale. We really could use your help. Susan's contact information is in the issue of the portal, which you just got, I believe. Another thing I wanted to do is to mention the annual holiday party. We have this year it'll be Sunday, December 12th from 2 to 4 at the home of Chuck and Louise Bickley. Chuck is the guy with a bald head wearing an orange shirt. Only one in the room. But he lives in the Francis Hammond house. And Francis Hammond was one of the original 13 settlers in Medfield. I've been in the house. It's a wonderful old house. It's on the address 7 Phillip Street, very close to South Street. And this is a members-only event. If you're not a member and would like to come, we'd love to have you join the society and join us at the party. This will be 2 to 4 p.m. On Sunday, the 12th of December. And I think now I will turn it over to a man who needs no introduction.
What we want to do tonight is give a little look at history lost and history saved. And at the very end, maybe come up with some ideas of what, as citizens of Medfield, we can do. I'm wearing my hat as the town historian in the sense, so I may be a little more partisan with that, because I feel strong on this. Everything you're going to see here I took in my lifetime living here in Medfield of what has been lost. So in the past 60 plus years, I didn't go before that, so basically from the early mid-50s on as examples that you see. And we're going to start with the Curtis Mansion, which would be right in front of you if you could look through the wall there. So they were the closest thing Medfield had to royalty, and their home built in 1859, the closest thing to a castle. The demolition of 50 North Street Mansion in 1987, along with the demolition in 1961 of son-in-law Edwin V. Mitchell's Manor Inn, which was next door, constituted an irreplaceable loss that damaged the appearance and character of Medfield, and which, looking back, produced strong agreement it should never have taken place. The family was the Curtises. Daniel D. Curtis came to Medfield from the wilds of Maine in 1851 at the age of 21. Here he was employed under Walter James in the manufacturing of straw hats. He rose fast through the ranks, and by 1856, he had entered into partnership with Mr. James. He married Ellen White in 1859 and built the North Street Mansion and tied into the White family, which had strong roots in Medfield's history. Upon the death of James in 1867, he succeeded in the ownership of the hat factory, which he then enlarged. His business increased in magnitude, and he built a new modern plant, which is now the Montrose School right beside you. He employed more than 1,000 persons and produced more than 2 million hats annually. Business was his life. He built many houses in town to be used as rental property for the workers at the hat factory. He carried on the steam mill, the box factory, from which the boxes were made that carried the hats to the national and international markets. In the midst of all his business dealings and his being politically and economically the most powerful man in Medfield, he died suddenly on December 7, 1885, of paralysis of the brain. His death truly impacted the entire town of Medfield. As William Tilden says in his history, a pall fell upon the entire community. Ellen White Curtis and her 4 children, Blanche, who married Edwin V. Mitchell, Maud, Bracy, and Daisy, then remodeled their Italian villa in 1888 into what you see here, the Queen Anne style. It remained until its demolition in 1987, the finest example of a Queen Anne style house in Medfield. With the Curtis and Mitchell mansions side by side on North Street and with Baker's Meeting House Pond across Ferry Street, that area could have passed for the mansions of Newport, Rhode Island. Here the Curtis lived in grand style. In 1925, Frank D. McCarthy purchased the house. McCarthy would go on to become a moderator in Medfield and then be elected state representative. His North Street home became a site of many political events and parties. McCarthy, a Republican, became good friends with Democratic Governor Paul Dever. Dever was out here often at McCarthy's house as a guest. In 1952, a rift developed within the Republican Party, with many Republicans feeling that McCarthy had become too friendly with the Democratic governor. Local resident Bill Nurse ran against McCarthy in the Republican primary, defeating the incumbent in Medfield 494 to 411. And winning in the district. There was clearly no love lost between the two Republicans. Norse had hoped one day to purchase McCarthy's mansion, to which McCarthy is reported to have replied, "It will never happen." McCarthy died suddenly the following year of a heart attack. He had served the town as town council moderator and selectman and representative. After McCarthy's death, the 50 North Street mansion was put up for sale. What happens next, according to local town law, was what appeared to be a straw man. Now, a straw man is when a buyer gets someone else to buy a house he was unable to purchase. And with the agreement, that person will, in turn, then sell the house to him. The North Street house was sold to Robert and Linda Lovell of Newton on September 30th, 1957. And then 3 months later, in January of 1958, they sold it to William Nurse. Despite McCarthy's wishes, Nurse had got the house after all. A lawyer by profession, Representative Nurse and his wife raised their family here in Medfield. Representative Nurse served as town moderator, and in 1979, Nurse petitioned to have his property moved from being residentially zoned to business zoned. At the same time, the Medfield Historical Commission was attempting to establish an historic district that would run from East Main Street through the center of town and include Nurse's historic property on North Street. Nurse was able to mount a successful town meeting campaign in getting his property rezoned, while at the same time, the historic district went down to defeat. Without an historic district to protect it, the successful rezoning of 50 North Street Queen Anne Mansion, the stage was set for the eventual destruction of the landmark. In 1985, Bill Nurse ran for selectman and won unopposed. The following year, Nurse announced to sell the landmark house to Jackson Fabrics of Needham, who planned to tear the structure down and build a new building to house the fabric business. Many thought the Queen Anne Mansion would be perfect setting for a fabric store. Jackson claimed the building had been neglected for too long and too many renovations would be required. Gay Bonaldi, who put on an unsuccessful bid on the house, said she knows interested preservation-minded buyers who had met the asking price and were turned away. Town pressure mounted on saving the landmark. Susan Sauter mounted a petition drive to save the house. The following year, Selectman Nurse attempted a comeback run for state representative, a position he held in the 50s. He was defeated in the Republican primary, losing in his hometown of Medfield. The following year, Selectman Nurse ran for re-election and lost overwhelming in the selectman race to political newcomer Harry Petroni, 1142 to 308. That's why Harry's here today. All attempts to save the house failed, and in June of 1987, we said goodbye. The 128-year-old former Curtis mansion succumbed to the repeated attacks of the backhoe. Gone were the corner towers, the oriel windows, the large encircling porch, the exterior dressed in white wood shingles, arranged in a variety of shapes and patterns. Its interior characterized by shining wood floors, spacious rooms, Victorian details, and the once sweeping lawn with large scenic shade trees. In its place, it was replaced with that. The Gilded Age look of North and Ferry Street is gone forever. That's 50 North Street. This is on North Street, opposite the new police and fire station. The apartment's up. This was the Pfaff mansion. Okay, who was Hannah Adams Pfaff? A name no one ever seems to pronounce correctly. She was born Hannah Adams Gardner here in Medfield, November 16, 1832, and was the namesake and grandniece of the famous Hannah Adams, the first female author in America to receive money for her work, one of the first feminists in American history, and the founder of the first women's club in America, which the Hannah Adams Club continues here in Medfield to this day. She married the wealthy Boston brewer Jacob Pfaff, who, along with his brother Henry, owned the H&J Pfaff Brewing Company, founded in 1857. Jacob ran the brewery from 1857 until his death in 1900. The Pfaffs were quite wealthy, and they entrenched into the social who's who world of Boston politics and Boston elite. His beer became one of the most popular in America, with that little bit of German that created demand for the new German-type lager beer. For a time, the Pfaffs lived in the Back Bay Mansion at 104 to 106 Beacon Street. In 1886, they bought the John Jay Mansion you see before you on North Street at the head of Dale Street. This land was the original site of the Lowell Mason House, which had been divided and moved earlier in 1875. Part of the house went to Adams Street, and then a couple of years ago was moved to its new location on Green Street. After the house was moved, John Jay built the mansion you see before you, and then John Jay died in 1879. The Pfaffs moved into the mansion in 1888 and used it as their summer home. The land continued across the street where the Pfaff Center and Dale Street School are today. Jacob died in 1900. In 1914, their son Charles went to the Medfield town meeting with the following gift for the town. And in his letter read at town meeting, he said, "In accordance with the wish of my mother, Hannah Adams Pfaff, and on her behalf, in remembrance of her childhood days in Medfield, I desire to give to the town of Medfield the lot of land situated on the west side of North Street and the north side of Dale Street," and that's where the Pfaff Center and Dale Street School are located today. The legacy of the Pfaff gift lives on today, and the Pfaff mansion across the street on 121 North Street was demolished in the 1970s and was replaced by this current apartment building. The Howard Estate. This is where CVS is today. Willard Howard Mansion, 555 Main Street, which stood where CVS is today. The mansion was demolished in 1958 to make way for Medfield's first supermarket called Super Duper. The current CVS store is located inside that original Super Duper building. Now, Willard Howard was a prominent citizen in Medfield from the late 1800s until his death in 1916. He was one of the original curators of the Medfield Historical Society, was the town's first tree warden, and he served for many years on the Library Board of Trustees. He permitted the Medfield Fire Department to store its horses in the barn that you see next to the house. Back at that time of the horse-drawn fire departments, the fire apparatus was stored in the rear of Town Hall. The horses were in Willard Howard's barn. During a fire, the horses would have to be brought on the run from Willard Howard's stable, down Main Street, through Medfield Center, down the hill onto James Avenue, onto the yard, to the back of Town Hall. The horses would be attached to the fire apparatus and driven to the fire with bells clanging. Willard Howard died in January 19th of 1916 at the age of 80. In his will, he left $1,000 to the library to be used for the purchase of books for the new library that was going to be built. Howard, who also married into the Baxter family, also left the town the land opposite the house, which is today's Baxter Park. So that's how Medfield got that land in Main and Spring Street, with the request that the new park be named in honor of his wife. Baxter Park, by the way, will be celebrating its 100th anniversary as a town park next year. The building went from different families, and in 1958, this building you see before you was demolished and replaced with that. And today, of course, we have, with some remodeling they did a couple of years ago, the CVS building. My favorite, Mitchell's Mansion on 60 North Street. This would be where the post office is today. It was a house like no other Medfield had ever seen, a mansion of seismic proportions. Its destructions 54 years ago in a warlike assault by a 24-ton M19A Army tank is an event likely never to be repeated in Medfield. It was Colonel Mitchell's Manor, later known as the Manor Inn. It stood where the post office stands on North Street. It was owned by Medfield's wealthiest resident, Colonel Edward Vinyl Mitchell, owner of the second largest hat factory in the United States, which was tucked in across North Street next to you where the Montrose School is. In 1898, Mitchell remodeled and enlarged the original house at the sensational cost in those days of $90,000. The town showcase, it had 32 rooms, a library with a huge fireplace, mahogany paneling, a music room, and a large dining room. On the second floor were 11 bedrooms. This is the side facing north, and this is the side facing south. The third floor, like the first, was built as a scene of splendor. Here in this hall, on the third floor, it could hold up to 800 people. For his children, on the floor, he had hopscotch, checker, and backgammon on the floor. Originally, the property extended back to Vinyl Road. The grounds were beautifully landscaped lot, including a tennis court, carriage shed, and barn. Upon the death of Mitchell in 1917, the property remained in the family until it was sold to Clinton Frost and turned into a hotel. Because of the elaborate decor, it catered to a wealthy clientele. The passage of the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act in 1919 all but doomed the liquor dispensing phase of the hotel business. From 1919 to 1933, and the passage of the 21st Amendment, the building was unoccupied. With the repeal of Prohibition, the property was purchased by John Coyle, who reopened the former mansion under the name of the Manor Inn. Under his management, the business flourished with his lobster and steak dinners, known throughout the area. With its 800-person capacity hall on the third floor, it also became a mecca for wedding receptions. In 1950, upon the death of John Coyle, the property was left to nephew Peter Gately, who changed the Manor Inn to a tavern only. In 1961, he sold the property to the North Street Plaza Corp., who in turn wanted to demolish the historic mansion and build in its place a strip mall which could anchor a restaurant. Here's some of the scenes inside of the Mitchell Mansion. In order to demolish a building of the magnitude of the Manor Inn, it was decided to bring a tank in for the destruction. On a cool April morning, over 1,000 Medfield residents lined North Street and all the areas around the Manor Inn. It was a wartime battle between a historic house and the tank. At first, the tank assaulted the house. The operation had to stop, an early victory for the house. As with all the preparations, they forgot to shut off the electricity. After an hour delay, the tank began a 7-hour battle on the Medfield landmark. Darkness fell on the first day, with the house still standing. Round 2 began at 1 p.m. Sunday and continued with another day-long assault. Night closed on the session with the Manor Inn still standing, although severely shaken. Crowds continued to swell the site, with residents jockeying for the best ringside position. On Monday, day 3, the skies opened up with thunderous downpour. The tank, now assisted by a relief bulldozer, began its final assault. The tactic was effective, and the once mighty town showcase was now no more than a scattered mass in the dirt on North Street.
A footnote. Richard, a footnote.
Yep.
Leroy Jones drove the tank that destroyed the house. His brother donated the horses that we pulled at the mill. He used to pull out the turbine at the mill.
Oh, wow. So the connection's still there.
Yeah. He's got some great shots as well.
And that's where it was replaced by. The strip mall, which for many years was anchored by a Chinese restaurant. The mansion of Mitchell, turned luxury hotel and finally tavern, a unique piece of Medfield's history and architect, a building that was on par with the mansions of Newport, was now gone for all time. A sad chapter of how much of Medfield's special past, an aspect that makes Medfield Medfield, has been needlessly destroyed by demolition. The strip mall you see there was in turn replaced in 1998 by the Medfield Post Office, which is now there today. Tom Sweeney's here. I had to put this slide in. This, of course, is the Harding Post Office. This one was built in 1903. It closed in 1972. A little quaintness on Harding Street. It was demolished in 2004. That's Tom's mom and dad there. What was the dog's name, Tom? This is 414 Main Street, opposite Brook Street. This was the Parker Mansion. And Blake and Mary Parker moved to Medfield in 1833. Blake drove the stagecoach between Medfield and Socket, Rhode Island. And later, when the route was reduced, he covered the ride between Medfield and Walpole. Blake died here in town in 1871. Henry Marshall Parker was born September of 1840. Henry would go on to become one of the wealthiest individuals in Medfield. He was a selectman from 1888. That's not why he's wealthy. Until his death in 1900. He owned a lot of real estate in town as well. Henry lived in the estate on East Main Street, directly opposite Brook Street. The house was built in the mid-1800s and was lived in by Henry Parker from the 1870s until his death in 1900. It passed in ownership from the Parker family and was owned in the 1930s by the Hammerly family. The photo you see right there was taken in 1947 when the house and property were owned by the Locker family. The estate was one of the many mansions and historic homes that grace East Main Street, what I call the gateway into Medfield. Over the years, several have been lost to the wrecking ball, including this, the Parker estate. But many have also been saved and restored, thanks to the purchase of historic-minded people who bought the properties and restored them. And in early 1970s, this was torn down and replaced by these two houses. This is 9 South Street, which is the parking lot of Brothers right now. And this was taken down as well to expand the parking lot of then Lords. 34 South Street barn, which dates around 1860, was demolished with the building of the new homes that recently went on to Hale Place. The house was saved, the barn was lost. This is 78 North Street, which dated to 1860. It was demolished to make way for the current Rockland Trust parking lot you see there. This is 164 Pine Street, which dated to the 1740s, a pre-revolutionary. Historical Commission fought hard on this one, but they waited out the delay and demolished this house and built a new, I guess you'd call it McMansion. These are 3 unique barns that all joined together at 111 Pine Street, also were recently demolished to enlarge the front yard of the new McMansion that was built there. This is 121 West Street, which will be down by where Will's Hardware is today, that area. It dated to 1760. It too was demolished. This is 367 Main Street, which is going towards Shaw's, just past Robertsboro Road on the left. And I call this the tale of 2 towns. In 2011, it was the best of time for Westwood and the worst of time for Medfield. Almost simultaneously, the 2 towns, 2 historic homes, took drastically different turns. Westwood's history took a boost with the announcement that Master's Touch, which was then in Medfield, would be renovating Westwood's historic 1810 Obed Baker house. They would be building a new support foundation for the house, new windows, walls, ceilings, restore this well-preserved example of federal period architecture, and save a special piece of Westwood's history and town character. It would be a shining example of how history does not have to be destroyed, but can be saved and preserved. At the same time Westwood's Baker house is being saved, Medfield's historic 1817 Joel Baker homestead on 367 Main Street was demolished. More than a year passed. The developer bought the property, submitted plans to demolish the house. Due to the historic nature of the house and its visible location along Main Street, the Medfield Historical Commission issued a 1-year demolition delay in an attempt to work with the developer to save the house. The developer instead submitted plans for the building of 2 new houses on the Baker site and waited the 1-year delay out. That delay ended when the house that had survived 192 years of our history was demolished. While the center and west ends of Main Street are protected by historic districts, No such district protects East Main Street. Therefore, the historic homes along this gateway into Medfield Center are subject to demolition. 20-year-old Joe Baker came to Medfield in 1817 from the west woods of Dedham, now Westwood. Here he bought the land along Main Street, known as the Thurston Lot, and built a house that was torn down. He married Abigail Heaton of Charlestown, New Hampshire, and raised 3 children. His son Joseph later entered the business with Jacob Cushman and established the carriage-making industry located at the end of Baker's Pond, to my right, your left. The horse-drawn carriages built over there were sold throughout New England. Joel's daughter Julia married George Chenery, who upon his death left the town of Medfield money to build our town hall. The half-mile stretch of East Main Street, from Pound into the center of town, contains examples of homes built in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s, and 1900s in historic architecture style, rising from early colonial to Victorian. That house was torn down and replaced by this much more modern house that's there now. This is next to Levels on Main Street, going down towards Hartford Street. I call it the Petrosini House. Dates the early 1930s. Was recently demolished to make way for the parking lot at Levels. Barns are another aspect that has long been in Medfield's history. We've lost the number. This is the Wilkins barn on 405 Main Street, demolished in the 1990s. The dwindling number of barns that remain. This is the 1783 Baptist parsonage. It was the Baptist parsonage from 1783 until 1840. It was then sold to Joseph Miller, whose land was later subdivided into Miller Street. That's why it's called Miller Street. It was then sold to Percy Johnson, and the house was demolished in 1967 with the building of the Needham Bank. The Boyden barn, this is on the corner of Elm and Cross Street, was built in 1848 by Silas Boyden, who had lived here in Medfield from 1801 to 1881. The barn was demolished in the 1990s. It's kind of an interesting house here, although it may not look it. This was 53 to 55 Brook Street, and it was part of the original Reverend Wilson Homestead, which is where Town Hall is today. It dates from 1652. It was renovated in 1778, and in 1872, the Town Hall, Medfield built its first Town Hall on the site, and the Wilson Homestead was divided into 3 sections and was moved. One part went to Oak on the corner of Oak and South Street, where it later burnt to the ground. One part went to 18 Green Street, where it is still a residence today. And the other part, the third part here, went to 5355 Brook Street, where it was demolished in 1988 to make way for the current condo complex that is on that site. This is the circa 1685 Russell Homestead. It was rebuilt after the Indian attack on Medfield during the King Philip War. It actually still contained the original well inside the house. It was demolished in the 1990s for a new home in that location. This is 84 Harding Street, just before where Harding Street divides with Hospital Road on the left-hand side. And it was the 1750 Sherman House. And again, it was recently demolished to make way for McMansion on that site. This is 77 North Street, which was built in 1840, and it was the Bullard Homestead. It later became the Medfield Hotel. It was demolished in 1965, and it's on location where Bullard's Market is today. This is 66 Foundry Street, which dated to 1750, the very end of Foundry Street, the dirt part where Foundry Street ends at the Walpole line. It was recently demolished also, and a very modernistic house just this past year and a half was built on that location. This is number 1 Main Street, right at the Medfield-Dover line if you're coming in from Dover. I'm calling it the Girag House. They came to America by the millions. Some 2 million Huguenots, or French Protestants, that fled France after the Edict of Nantes in 1685 designated France an official Catholic country. At first, the edict protected the Protestants from persecution at the hands of the Catholic Church, but that soon wore away, and the Huguenots faced a life of hardship and persecution. By the end of the 17th century, roughly 200,000 Huguenots fled France and relocated to Protestant nations such as English America. One of the Huguenots that fled France, arrived in Medfield in 1718. His name was Dr. James Durrell, and he was a family of 21 children. He arrived here with his wife and at least 2 of the children. We don't know where the other 19 went. Actually, maybe that's why he fled, not the edict. In 1721, he purchased the Joseph Adams homestead on 1 Main Street on what is today the Dover-Medfield town line. The house was burnt by arson in June of 1985. A complete investigation took place. What happened is, just before that house was set on fire, 2 other fires took place elsewhere in Medfield on the other end of town. So first our fire department had to respond to 1 fire in the north end of town, and then another fire broke out, and after they were battling those 2 flames, then this house went up into flames as well. And so by the time the fire department, who had been stretched thin fighting the other 2 fires, arrived, the house was a tinderbox. The investigation never solved who burnt down the Girag House, but the land was then sold, and the entire development that's in there now was then built. You can make your own judgments on that. This is 70 North Street. It's nestled along North Street as one of the calling cards of North Street's gateway in the Medfield Center. Its humble origins date to the American Revolution, but its original remains are a mystery. Sometime between 1838 and 1852, it was moved to the current location at 70 North Street from an unknown location. For more than 150 years, this 18th century wood-frame side gable structure played an important part in Medfield's rich history. It is now gone, demolished a couple of weeks ago. Another piece of the character and history of our town has disappeared. With the help of Society librarian Cheryl O'Malley, we learned that the Ord family featured prominent in this house's history. John Ord and his wife came here from Scotland. They were married in 1836 when he was 27, she was 19. Shortly after their marriage, he came to Boston. She remained in Scotland until after giving birth to their first child. They arrived in Medfield in 1838, and John took up the profession as a brushmaker. 1852, John acquired this house. The couple was blessed with 7 children, one of which died young. The children grew up here on 70 North Street, on the fringe of Medfield Center. John Jr. worked as a carriage maker in Medfield for the Cushman Baker Carriage Manufacturing. Their 5th child, James, was born in 1843. He enlisted into the Civil War in August of 1862, Company D, Massachusetts 1st Cavalry. As a private, he served in Virginia. He mustered out in October of 1864. After the war, he served as commander of Medfield's Moses Ellis Post 117, Grand Army of the Republic. It was James who constructed the James Ord Block in 1882, which is located at 445 Main Street on the corner of James Ave and Main Street and across from Town Hall, the site of the former Will's Hardware Master's Touch that's now being developed into the restaurant. He kept a store and a furniture dealer on this location for many years. He held many positions in town, including teacher and postmaster. James never married, but continued to live at 70 North Street with his parents until his father's death in 1900, at which time his mother went to live with his sister in Westboro. From the Yords, the property next went to E.V. Mitchell, owner of the hat factory, later renamed the E.V. Mitchell Company. The 70 North Street home was now used for housing for the hat factory workers, many coming to Medfield from Canada and Maine to work. From Mitchell, it next passed into the ownership of the Bullard family, then the Penniman family, followed by the Meehan-Waring family, and then to the Sweet family. Its most recent owners were Bob and Mary Kinsman. 70 North Street history came to an end this past month, and with its passing, another piece of the fabric that makes Medfield Medfield is gone. Can you save historic houses? I believe you can. Historic houses can be saved and restored and be financially profitable or sold or lived in. They can also keep Medfield's charm and historic character that is a piece of that fabric that indeed makes Medfield Medfield. This is on South Street, just past the railroad tracks, Elm Street, going towards Route 27, and it's the Sabin Meehan Homestead. Sabin Meehan was born in 1747 and resided with his parents on South Street near Main Street. In 1777, he bought this house on South Street, just past Elm Street and the railroad tracks. He kept a tavern here for many years and became a large land owner. During the American Revolutionary War, he was captain of a company in Colonel Wheelock's regiment in the Continental Army. He married Hannah Plimpton in 1775, who died in 1782. He married his second wife, Mary Stearns of Attleboro, 3 years later. Sabin died in 1800 and requested that he be buried in the back lot of the house yard, as he said, to watch Charles Hammond when he took toll at the grist mill below his property on Kingsbury's Pond. So this is up high. He's buried in the backyard overlooking the grist mill. Interesting request.
Did they find him when they started doing the work?
The grist mill folks are looking for that body there. After his death, the house went under ownership of the oldest son, Ellis. Ellis was born in 1778, graduated from Harvard College in 1800, studied medicine. He practiced here in Medfield for a number of years. He was said to be a young man of promise, but he died in 1807 at the age of 28. He married Kesey Harding in 1801, who survived him by 51 years. The Meehan family retained possession of the house and property for many, many years before it was sold to Benjamin Chenery. It was recently in the ownership of the Kingsbury family for over 70 years, and it just was recently sold, and the new owner is going to totally restore and rehab the house. If you go by it, you can see he's doing a good job on that, so this house will be saved. This was built shortly after Thomas Jefferson left the White House. James Madison was president, and the United States was war with Great Britain in the War of 1812. The most powerful ship in the United States Navy was the USS Constitution, Old Ironsides, and it was sinking British ships in the ocean waters from Canada to Brazil. And James Fairbanks completed the building of what became Medfield Showcase at 34 South Street. In 1823, Fairbanks sold the South Street house to Warren Chenery. Here inside the house, Medfield's largest industry, the making of straw hats, would begin as a straw hat cottage industry. Chenery became so successful that in 1857 he built a 3-story hat factory next door to his home. It was called the New England Straw Works, and was one of the largest straw hat factories at the time. He and his son George worked in partnership. The New England Straw Works, along with the 34 South Street Mansion, was one and one of the largest barns were still standing when it was sold to Jeremiah B. Hale. Hale would go on to serve Medfield almost every elected and appointed position in town. This house was saved. It was totally gutted. It was razed. They lost the barn, but the house itself was saved. In 1998, the Massachusetts Historical Commission researched this house, and in their form they stated that the property was in good condition. It ended by saying that the Chenery House on 34 South Street possesses integrity of location, design, setting, material, workmanship, and association that meets the criteria to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. This is on Pleasant Street, 41 Pleasant Street, and it dates to about 1850. This too had the one-year demolition delay bylaw put on it, and the developer that originally was going to tear down, put a double house there, saved this house. Between 1854 and 1878, Catholic services were being said in area halls and private homes. In 1878, Father Brennan, who was unable to walk, came to live at the home of John Sullivan here at 41 Pleasant Street, where he stayed for 3 years. He celebrated Mass here and ministered to the spiritual needs of the people until 1880, when he went to Foxborough. He was succeeded by Father Callahan. Under Father Callahan, Masses continued to be offered here in the Sullivans Pleasant Street home. In November 1890, Father Callahan was transferred, and Medfield became attached to the Sacred Heart Parish in South Natick. By 1939, this house was owned by Kenneth Clark. A lot of you will remember. It remained in private residency, and so this house, too, has been saved. This is one of my favorite, and I don't think the family that has done the work here has gotten the credit. Maybe I'll just give a plug if the Historical Commission is listening when they give their Preservation Award. They've done a marvelous job saving this. This is the George Whitefield Adams house. George Whitefield Adams was the brother of Hannah Adams. The house was built in 1800. Adams was an organ manufacturer and a teacher. Later, the house actually was owned but not actually lived in by Lowell Mason. And they've done saving of this house. Again, originally we thought the house was going to be torn down. The owner, Mr. Lanigan, held out and wanted to sell it to someone that was going to save the house. And they've done a great job restoring that. Oh, it'd be nice telling you, wouldn't it? This is on North Street, going towards the police station, just past Green Street on the right, 3 down on the right, on the way to the police and fire station. That new project where they're building condos is across the street. This is also kind of interesting. This is on Elm Street, the property of 72 Elm Street, just before the bend when you get to Millbrook. And the bond dates to about 1850. And the family that recently bought the house is into history. But they also wanted to have an in-law place for the mother-in-law to live. And because of zoning, working with the ZBA, they felt they would have to tear down the barn to build a house there. But working with the ZBA, they agreed to use the barn as the house. And you can see they're turning that into an in-law suite. You can see the guys painting it barn red on the side. So that barn has been saved on 72 Elm Street. This is the Samuel Johnson house, which dates 1830. It was purchased in 1892 by the Archdiocese of Boston as a rectory for the newly built St. Edward's Church. And this would be where the library is today, the new addition of the library. And this house was moved in 1926 to where it is now on Green Street, just opposite the swim pond on Green Street. And there's a great story with this because the new priest of St. Edward's, Father McCool, wanted a new, more modern rectory, wanted a brick rectory, but this house was located there. And he said, I'm going to have a raffle. And you can buy a ticket, a $1 raffle ticket, and if you win the house. The only catch is you have to move it. And the story goes, Jim Tuberty, the Tuberty family had been in town here for years and years and years. Jim Tuberty, the story goes, had $1 in his pocket and was heading to buy some chewing tobacco. And he got stopped by Father McCool, who persuaded him that it was much better and probably holier to buy the chance for the house than the smoking tobacco. Well, Jim Tuberty bought it, and he wins. He won the house, which he really didn't want, and they ended up selling it. But the house was moved down here to Green Street. Peter Kennedy, some of you know Bobby Kennedy's son, bought the house, did a beautiful job restoring that, and so that house today has been saved. And the Historical Commission does give the Historic Preservation Award, and kind of a shout out for the Alewoods at 378 Main Street. This is on Main Street, right at the corner of Robert Sproul Road. And this house dated to 1860, and they've done a great job of restoring that house as well. And this is right next to the post office. Pete Peterson is here. Pete has an office in this building. This, again, has been saved. It's the J.E. Willard House. It dates from 1844. And again, the builder, Dave McCready, was able to save that, turn it into office space. So that house was saved. This is right here in the center of town where Bank of America is located. And it was built in 1817. You can see in the bottom what it looked like. It was built by Moses Harding for his daughter when she married Jonathan Bishop. It was purchased in 1822 by Philander Weyer. His widow Hannah then married Joel Everett in 1850. Grandson Joel married Grace Kane, and after Joel's death, Grace remarried Joe Roberts and conducted a funeral home out of the house. It was then sold to Bob Larkin, who then traded property with the Norfolk County Bank that had bought the building where Park Street Books is now. And he traded, so the bank got this house, Bob Larkin got where Park Street Books is, and that became his house. And then they had Rebel Palumbo for $1 buy the house and move it. And it was moved in three parts. So the main part of the house, this part, was moved over to Park Street, where it is now. The L of the house was moved to Pound Street, where it is now. And the two chimneys, because you can't move with the chimney, are now a patio on South Street. So this house is all over town. And the other real good story about Medfield Yankee ingenuity, the L was new, added on. It was just the main house. And the town, if you notice, Pleasant Street is very narrow. And the town wanted to widen Pleasant Street. Well, the owner didn't want the street coming on his property, so he built the L right out to the edge of the street, preventing a widening of Pleasant Street. So that house was moved and saved, and in its place, the bank was built. This is next to Cumberland Farms, across from Dunkin' Donuts. This house, also out of the 1840s, also was saved, and today has been restored. This also was in an historic district, which they were unable to tear it down because it was in an historic district. Okay, let's end with endangered. This is 13 South Street. I believe it's 1792, 93, 94, 95 in that area. Originally, the two houses, this is right next to the parking lot of Brothers, and the two houses used to be one, and they were located where Starbucks is now. And when Wheelock built the new store, they divided this store into two pieces and moved it down to South Street. So now it's 13 and 15 South Street, where it is today. 15, you can just see in the background, is a private residence. The individual that owns Brothers also owns this lot as well. This is also under a demolition delay bylaw. There's a lot of zoning issues, so you cannot just extend a parking lot into a residential area. You'd have to get a 2/3 vote out of town meeting on that. But this house is sitting on, I call the endangered list, as the clock counts down until the time of that house is up. And then we have, most of you know, is Ian Thompson's house. This is on North Street, directly opposite Pine Street. And it dates out of the 1840s as well. It was purchased, it has the 1-year demolition delay, and the current owner says if it doesn't sell, he'll just wait it out and we'll tear it down. There's also a barn in the back, as you can see there. Which brings us to the Clock Tavern. Clock Tavern actually, if you look, you can see clearly here, is actually two different houses. The son wanted to move away but not go too far. And added on to the house. So much history that's in this house. You have Revolutionary history. A lot of you remember from your U.S. history book the story of Nathan Hale. Nathan Hale was sent as the British went into New York, and George Washington, still up here in Boston, wanted to know what the British were up to, sent Nathan Hale as a spy down into New York City. And as you know, once he was down there, he was recognized as a spy and was put to death, and his last words were the immortal words, "I only regret I have one life to give for my country." Nathan Hale stayed here at the Clock Tavern. When Boston was being occupied, when the British were in Boston after the events of Lexington and Concord, and we had a number of militias all over New England coming in to keep the British hemmed into Boston, and we had the Connecticut militia actually was up here in the Medfield, because they knew if the British went to New York, there was a number of routes they could have taken. One was the Hartford Turnpike, which runs right through Medfield, and in that event, we wanted our militia along the way. Well, they didn't take this route. They actually went by sea. But the Connecticut militia actually stayed here on guard. And they stayed often in the Clock Tavern. And they ate, and they drank, and they drank, and they drank. And they ran up quite a bar bill. And Clark, being the patriot that he was, kind of wrote it off. But after the war was over, we actually have the receipt that he turned into the state of Connecticut for the bar bill. And to the credit of the state of Connecticut, they paid it. But this house later was on the Boston to Hartford Turnpike. The stage would come in. They would stop. The people would, as a tavern, as a restaurant, as a place to stay, would stay overnight, get something to eat or drink here, and then continue on the next day. All along the way, in the early 1800s, mid-1800s, you had these taverns. So people, could stay overnight and get a new change of horses for the stage, and they went to Hartford, then on to New York City and Point South. And the Clarks built, they're very clever entrepreneurs, and they built a hall in the back, which was one of the largest halls, so they could have dancing and music as an enticement for the stage to stop there. And so it was a beautiful hall in the back. We had dancing and music that would have taken place. Early Catholic masses were also said here before the building of St. Edward's Church. A number of weddings took place into that hall. And in more modern pictures of that, it became the two-family. again, sitting on what I call the gateway into Medfield, next to the historic Peak House as well. And the purchase in 2013 by the local family, the Lynards, was seen as a blessing for the town. The house would be saved, the tavern would be saved. I just want to give a shout out and thanks, because I think they have incredible patience. John and Michelle Lynard presented plans to restore the tavern and bring it back to its multifunctional usage. They hope to open a Sherman Inn type of a tavern. The town's historic zoning, approved by the residents at town meeting, permitted such usage in a residential area. The Lynards wanted to work with the neighborhood and community to develop a vision for the historic structure. They made their way through months and months and months of planning board, zoning board hearings, and meetings with neighbors to address concerns. Over 1,000 town residents signed an online petition supporting the Lynards' efforts. Finally, both the planning board and zoning board gave their unanimous approval. But since then, 3 families decided to take the town and the Lynards to court over the approval of the Clark Tavern to become a tavern restaurant, bringing the Lynards' efforts to a temporary standstill as the issue moves with glacial speed through our court system. That brings a close of a little look at, just in my lifetime, of the number of houses lost and also houses that have been saved, and we'll continue on kind of an endangered list. And I just want to take a couple of minutes, introduce you to a couple of people, because people say, well, what can the town do? I want to introduce you to Dan Bible, and I'm going to ask Dan if he would do 2 things for us. One, if he could tell us what exactly the demolition delay bylaw is, and second, if he could tell us, and Dan is going to be chair of a new committee we just set up, Community Preservation Act. So I surprised you with the first one, Dan, but just, but you're an expert on that. Just for a couple of minutes,
Okay.
And then we're going to introduce a couple other people.
Okay, great. The worst thing I could possibly do is follow a great speaker like that. I'm not going to be anywhere as good as Richard is. The demolition delay bylaw was passed by town meeting in 1994, and it basically says if any property more than 50 years old, the owners have applied for a demolition permit, that property comes before the Historic Commission, which David Temple and I are co-chairs along with some other local residents. And we look at the property. We look at the history of the property, the architecture, the style of the property, to see whether it is historically significant. And if it's historically significant, then we take a vote to determine whether it should be preferably preserved. Because it's our view that the rights of the property owner are very important, that people should be able to do what they want to do with their property. But at the same time, it's important for us and the Historic Commission to try to protect and preserve the historic character of the town of Medfield. And so we try to balance both of those things. Richard was talking about a 12-month demolition delay. At the last town meeting, that was increased to an 18-month demolition delay. And the reason for the demolition delay is to give the owners an opportunity to find a way to preserve or protect, to rehabilitate, or to find someone who would buy the property to do those things, to preserve those things which we think are important that maintain the character of the town of Medfield. You can't do it in every case. And we have lost a number of significant properties, but we have saved some. Richard talked about some of these. The house on Hale Place, the house on South Street. Some of these houses have come before us because it's cheaper to demolish a house than to preserve it. And in many cases, builders want to find the cheapest way to go forward. We're giving them an opportunity to find another way, to try and preserve and protect. In some cases it works. It doesn't work in every case, but it does work in some cases. So that's one thing that we have in Medfield. The other thing, Richard said that I'm in charge of the committee. I don't know. It's like when people said anyone who wants to volunteers stepped forward, and I wasn't listening, and everyone took a step back. So thank you, Richard. Okay. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts passed legislation about 15 years ago called the Community Preservation Act. The CPA is an opportunity for towns like Medfield to basically set up a savings account. 158 cities and towns in Medfield have passed this, incorporated this CPA into their town legislation and are saving money which can be used for four things: historic preservation, open space recreation, affordable housing, and what's the fourth thing? I forget what the fourth.
Recreation, open space.
Open space. Thank you. Open space. Okay. Thank you. What this would do, in effect, is put a 1 to 3% surcharge on property tax. So we would pay money into this account, and the state matches that money with fees that are raised at the Registry of Deeds. If we did this in Medfield, and we had a 1% surcharge on your property tax, not increasing your tax, but a surcharge on your tax, the average property in Medfield is assessed at about $590,000. The legislation allows us to take the first $100,000 off that, and a 1% surcharge on your property tax would be about $80 a household. $80 a household per year. The state has been matching that money, that savings account that we could set up, at about an 18% interest rate. So if you think about how much interest you're getting at your savings account now, is it 1%? Is it 0.5%? Is it 0.01%? The state is giving towns that have incorporated the CPA about an 18% return on the savings that we would get ourselves in Medfield. And that money can only be used for things like Richard was talking about. Trying to preserve and protect the historic properties. We have a number of these in Medfield. The Dwight Derby House, the Lowell Mason House, the Kingsbury Grist Mill, that wonderful property up at the State Hospital, which we've paid for 100% ourselves, but we need to put more money into that to preserve and protect it. If we had CPA funding in Medfield, we could use those funds along with the money we're getting from the state to do the things that we're going to do anyhow. So this is something which we're exploring right now. Richard says we've set up a committee. We haven't set up a committee. What we're trying to do right now is to find out if people in Medfield think this is a good idea. I happen to think it is. I think Richard probably thinks it's a good idea. I don't want to speak for you. But we tried this before at town meeting, and it failed because we didn't really get enough interest from people like yourselves. So that's what we want to do right now. We want to set up an exploratory committee to find out if people like you would be willing to vote in favor of something like this. If we have enough interest, we're willing to go forward and have a warrant at town meeting. But this has to be something that the citizens of Medfield think is worthwhile. It's not just historic preservation. Obviously, all of you are interested in that because you're here. But it's also recreation, open space, affordable housing, things that we're going to do ourselves. We've spent money on things like the Holmquist land, the Redgate Farm. We know that the school board is going to ask for money to renovate the playing fields because they need to preserve and protect those. They're going to come before town meeting at some point, and we're probably going to vote in favor of things like that, and we're going to pay 100% of it. But if we had CPA in effect, the state would be giving us money to do the things that we would do ourselves anyhow. So that's what we're going forward on right now, just to find out if people like you would be willing to support it if you had enough information. We'll be willing to certainly talk to other groups, talk in front of this group in the future to present more information. I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about that. David?
Yeah. The town voted down the Community Preservation Act several years ago. How much would we have saved on those land purchases if we had adopted it? Do you know?
Well, it's not. I don't think it's possible to say exactly how much, because the amount of money that the state gives back to the towns depends on how much money is generated at the Registry of Deeds, and that obviously varies as houses are bought or sold. Now, it's not just houses bought or sold in Medfield; it's a statewide amount. Over the last 5 years, towns have got about a 25% return on the money they've gotten. So if Medfield had a 1% surcharge, we would have raised, I actually have the figures here. Funny you should ask. In 2005, Medfield would have raised about $261,000 from a 1% surcharge from the taxpayers, the residents and the businesses in Medfield. And the state would have given us about a 25% return on that, or about an additional $65,000. So if you look at, we tried this, I believe, in 2005. So that was 6 years ago. Over 6 years, we would have gotten, I can't do this in my head, about $200,000 from the state to do the things that we would do ourselves.
Let me, we're just trying to get you a little bit thinking of what options you have, because I want to introduce now, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
How did that happen? I want to introduce you to Mike Taylor, a little bit, what is an historic district?
Well, let me preface also to say that every house that you saw tonight that was torn down could have been saved if that house had been in a historic district. So the town does have a mechanism in place. In 1991, they created a mechanism for the town to protect its historical resources. The trick is that you need a 2/3 majority vote at town meeting, and you really have to have the support of the neighborhood if you're going to create a historic district. Now, fortunately, the town has been able to create 4 historic districts. We originally, the John Metcalf Historic District, which is West Main Street, had 4 houses, and we expanded district twice with your support. Now it includes 23 homes. It also includes Baxter Park as well as Boyden, Hill Grill. The other historic district is the Town Center Historic District, which includes structures such as the old board store, now Brothers Market, includes the ore block, the mill harbor. One of the reasons why that structure is not being torn down is because it's a historic district. It also includes the Starbucks, but it also includes other houses along North Street. When we tried to create that historic district, at the time we made it voluntary. So if you don't want to be part of the district, you don't have to be. In 70 North Street, they chose to opt out. And the reason why it's especially important today is that we've been struggling for 12 years to try to create an historic district along East Main Street. One of the proposals involved the district starting at Pound Street, including the tavern, all the way down to the Baptist Church, which would have connected to the Town Center Historic District. And many of us would say that's kind of a no-brainer. However, there was 4 or 5 people that lived in that district that didn't want it, and they were going to fight tooth and nail. So we've been struggling with this for some time. And there are proposals more recently to try to create a much smaller district including the Leonard Morris House, the Peak House, and the Tavern. It started out small and then eventually expanded. And for those, I think probably everyone was in a town meeting about 10 years ago when we tried to create a district around North Street. Right? And even though I'd say about 98% of the, 95% of the people that lived in that district wanted to become part of it, there was basically one person who started a campaign to stop the district because if there's enough uncertainty in town meeting, they just don't pass. So anyway, so we do have a mechanism in place. You can't, you know, place. If we became like Nantucket, you could make the whole town a school district. But I don't think that would ever pass. But if you have any thoughts of areas in town that we should be exploring, especially if there's town support, that makes a lot of sense. So I don't know if there's any questions about certain districts or.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. One last thing, when you leave, Chris, if you over there, she's put together, if you're interested, a list of 10 different things that you could do, and she has a handout and a layout. Did you want to say something about that, Chris, at all?
No, I think I did a couple articles a few years ago for the Medfield Press, did a lot of research, and I think that one common theme that runs through this is that the neighborhoods that where we all live, so it's so important to get to know your neighbors, to talk to your neighbors, to have a lot of antique houses that are around you. Really just talk about what people's plans are for their houses. I think there have been opportunities in town where people have gotten together and talked to the owners and said, you know, we would like to have the option to buy your house before you put it on the marketplace. I know a couple of streets over Office House Street that's happening too. Or houses get sold through friends if there's a risk of it being torn down, because people are looking for, you know, we have middle-income families that are getting closed out of Medfield, and there are opportunities for those houses to go to families that are having a hard time getting into town, and it preserves the housing stock and it preserves the diversity of our housing in Medfield. So getting to know your neighbors, I think, is a really important thing, because you can do just by getting together and talking about the importance of your neighborhood and what you want to see the neighborhood be and where it goes is really important. So that's just probably the biggest thing.
The preceding was a production of Medfield TV, Community Show.